This podcast contains our own personal views not associated with any organisation. Coronial contains descriptions of death inquests that may be graphic and disturbing to some listeners. Discretion is advised.
Welcome back, everyone, to Coronial. I'm Georgie.
I'm Emma.
And I'm Alice.
All right, so this week we're going to do another compilation episode, which I'm really excited about because it's less work for me. And we'll let you guys figure out the theme. Today I'm going to be telling you about the death of Maurice Bauer, who died while at work on the 1st of March 2006. And this inquest was pretty short, so normally we go into the background of the people who pass away. I can give you nothing about Mr. Bauer.
Aww.
Nothing. He was barely even mentioned in the inquest, which was really interesting because they went on about the other stuff more than him.
Do we know how old he was or anything like that?
Not even a clue.
Wow. Okay,
Yeah. I've got nothing for you other than his name. And also, some of the other people in the inquest as well, I also didn't get their full names or anything like that as well. So I found that interesting. And I guess it's just that's what happens when there's shorter, less detailed ones. It's probably common, but the ones that we are reading are typically longer. So we're used to that larger amount of information. So
what year was yours from?
2006. It was released in 2008.
Because mine was also released in 2008.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have much background information on him either.
Which states?
Queensland?
WA.
Okay.
All right. So maybe it's also a product of time, but...
Yeah.
Tony. Mr. Bauer was working on a property in Mullaney, north of Brisbane, as a trade assistant with one other individual and an electrician who was contracted to provide electrical wiring to this property that was being built. So on the day of Mr. Bauer's death, the team initially met at the electrician's workshop, packed up 2 vans with equipment and off they headed to the property. And that day specifically was the day that they were going to be moving the temporary electrical service that had been used during the construction of the house. Presumably when a house is being constructed, the tradesmen need some electrical supply to the more fixed permanent switch box located attached to the house. Mm-hmm. This particular house was a 1-level house, but as is common in Queensland, the ground was sloping. And so that slope progressed from the front of the house down towards the backyard, so that there was ultimately a deck coming off the back that was raised, and the back of the house was supported by a number of metal poles. The house was a wooden constructed frame with metal wall cladding, a steel roof, and steel beams that supported the timber of the deck, but again was also in contact with the metal cladding of the house. Subtle, foreshadowing here.
Lot of metal.
Yes, metal.
That all connects with each other. It's not single standalone sections.
Yeah, right.
And so the temporary supply that had been available was in a metal box located close to the house, and this box contained a min switch and other circuit breakers to control the supply to the house. And then the permanent switch box was going to be located on the side wall of the garage of the house.
Which I think is fairly standard.
Yeah. All of it sounded very standard. The part that was less standard was that day the electrician decided to complete the work live, despite the fact that there was no requirement to do so.
Did they just felt like taking a chance that day? My day's a bit boring. Let's spice it up a little.
Spark things up a little bit, yeah.
I mean, it doesn't go into it. He obviously was very remorseful afterwards.
As it should be.
I suspect he thought that it was going to be a quick job. And now this is all just me making assumptions from reading it. That he thought it was going to be a quick job, and so the labour required to turn the circuit off or to disconnect wasn't warranted.
Yeah, right.
But that's just me making some assumptions there. And realistically, yes, absolutely. All of the regulations recommend not working live if you don't need to. It also appears that he didn't inform anyone of the fact that he wasn't disconnecting the electricity. And again, was there assumptions that others knew that he hadn't disconnected it, so therefore they knew he was working live? Unclear around that.
Yeah, I suppose it
didn't go
depends
into it
on the communication between the electrician. If he's like, I'm starting work now.
Yeah.
Or, they knew he was on site, but
Yeah.
who knows
And
what
there's
he's
an
doing.
electrician working here, so therefore electricity is involved.
Yeah.
Or did they all just make the assumption? Conversely, I could just imagine being like, oh, the electrician's here, so there's no electricity now because he started.
Yeah, or even just like the electrician is here, therefore it's safe because they know what they're doing.
True.
And they
Yeah,
know
that as
how
well.
to work safely.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so as I said, it didn't appear like he informed them, so it's unclear how much knowledge they had of that he was doing live work.
Yeah.
The electrician started by temporarily insulating the live conductors that were in the temporary box by placing plastic tape around them as per normal electrical standards. And then he took them to the new mains box and ultimately ended up securing them in there with zip ties. And this was due to poor weather, essentially. He had to kind of make the decision that he needed to pause, so he just quickly put them in the switch box, zip tied them there, shut the door, and then had to delay any further progress with this because of weather.
And it makes sense if it's raining, you probably don't want to be dealing with live electricity.
I would assume so. I would assume that is less than ideal. During this time, the mains box was then closed, but the live conductors were located within said closed switch box.
And this was the new switch box that was on the side,
of the house.
Yep.
Yes. A short while later, the other assistant, not Mr. Bauer, felt an electric shock while passing through the glass door into the garage. He called out to the electrician, who then warned the other workers to stay away from anything metal, whilst also essentially rushing to remove those cables from that new switch box.
Okay, so was alerted to the fact there was an issue and was doing something about it.
Yes.
It's not like he was like, it's all good, don't worry about it.
No, he was like, oh shit. And rightly so.
Yep.
Because at this point, they then attempted to warn Mr. Bauer that the house was potentially live, but there was no response. He was then found under the house, slumped over a pipe. And at the time being found, he was lying on a water-soaked carpet next to a metal beam with marks on his face.
Oh.
Do we know what he had been doing at the time?
No idea.
Something related to whatever his job was.
Yeah, he was under the house doing something. Not entirely sure what. And it sounded like they were all kind of working independently.
Yeah.
Right.
So this assistant risked his own safety, jumped underneath the house and grabbed Mr. Bauer, pulled him out and started CPR on Mr. Bauer.
Yeah, wow.
But unfortunately, by the time paramedics arrived, he was declared deceased on scene by those paramedics. On autopsy, Mr. Bauer was found to have abrasions to his nose and left lower cheek and bruises to his forehead and left upper cheek. But no other injuries were present and no obvious electrocution marks were present. So they weren't saying that those marks and bruising were as a result of electrocution. So presumably that therefore means that they were as a result of him falling during said event. But they couldn't find an input and an output kind of area like you would normally expect for an electrocution. But in the absence of any other reasonable cause for his death, they felt it was most likely in the story consistent with electrocution.
Did they find any signs of heart disease or anything like that?
Didn't go into anything other than just saying there was no other evidence of any reasonable cause for his death otherwise.
Interesting.
So, and again, because I don't know how old he was or anything like that, as to whether it was likely that he would just die of a heart attack on scene.
Was he on heart medication?
Or was he a 20-year-old?
That was totally fit and healthy and well?
Yeah.
Unclear.
Maybe not with a name like Morris, but...
Yeah, I'm like... Maurice suggests older.
Yeah.
But who knows? And I am just having to go by what's in the inquest and assume that, therefore, they were correct in saying there's really no other reasonable cause other than... And with this story, where he's next to a metal pole on something that is wet with a live house of electricity...
Yeah.
It stands to reason
and
that he most likely was
a mark on his body or something.
On his face, but
yeah.
Pathologists said they weren't consistent with marks as a result of electrocution. So I think it's more that they were marks that he hit his face when he fell, rather than input and output shock marks, which they couldn't find. Yeah, I don't know what you would expect to see.
No.
Yeah. Apparently, the pathologist still was happy to call that this was most likely death as a result of electrocution, and the coroner agreed with that. So obviously an investigation happened. This was on a work site. It raised immediate work health and safety investigation. And what ultimately was found was that the live conductor that had been wrapped in the tape had a burn mark and hence it had exposed the copper through the insulation tape. It was therefore an expert witness's opinion that these live conductors had been poorly insulated, and then as a result of being hurriedly wrapped and thrust into the switch box, because they were copper potentially pierced through that insulation, and therefore came into contact with the metal switch box on the internal side of the switch box that was attached to the house. There also then appeared to be an arc mark on the switch box, suggesting that electricity had been conducted to the metal of the switch box.
Yeah, okay.
Additionally, there was a neutral conductor that was not terminated, as it should have been, and a rod earth electrode that was not connected from the metal switch box to the ground. Again, I'm not an electrician, but those sound to me like there's meant to be other electrical work that is also meant to prevent serious conducting to the rest of like the house and that kind of stuff.
As far as I'm aware, there should be an earth for every...
Yeah, I think there
pretty
is.
much all like appliances and all that sort of stuff.
And I presume that was part of the rest of the day's work. You know, like that was part of connecting to the house and whatever. But maybe the order should have been different so that you put the earth in first, then connect to the live conductors.
Yeah.
And again, had the weather had an effect on this, it's not clear. The inquest doesn't state.
Yeah.
But maybe that, again, wasn't the planned order.
Yeah, it sounds like it definitely disrupted what was going to happen. So
Yeah. So when the copper wiring punctured, as I said, it's electrical energy connected to the metal parts of the house. And these were all able to circuit together. So that includes the garage sliding door frame and external cladding, the main building and north pavilion cladding, which I assume a north pavilion is the northern deck, a C-section beam. I don't know where that was located. It's just a C-section beam. And the main roof sheeting. So really, like, majority of the house.
Yeah, I was going to say the whole house is live at that point.
Yes.
No one touch any part of the house.
Yeah. Well, I'm surprised the other assistant didn't get electrocuted.
Yeah.
He is so lucky that he didn't touch any of the door.
Yeah,
if
as he
touched
through it.
Yeah. I suppose his shoes potentially touched it, but they didn't conduct the electricity.
Yeah.
It was estimated by the experts that this would have had a potential of about 240 volts of electricity travelling through the house. And the safe working level in Australia is considered to be 50 volts.
Yeah, okay.
That's quite a lot
So
more, isn't it?
5 times more? I can math. Yeah, about 5 times more.
About that, yeah.
Then the expert witness went on to estimate that anyone in contact with the ground who touched the beam, such as the one located near Mr. Bauer when he was found, could have resulted in electric shock that may have also continued for a considerable amount of time.
Yeah.
So it's not just like a one shock and that's it. It's
No.
You're continuing to get that electricity through your body,
Yes.
which will continue to mess with your heart.
And yes, they said for most people, such a shock would be fatal.
Mm-hmm.
So the electrical safety regulations state that a licensed electrical worker must ensure that electrical installation is performed in accordance with the wiring rules. But these regulations are only pretty general, stating that cables must be insulated to provide, and I quote, a degree of installation not inferior to that of the conductors. So it doesn't really tell you anything specific other than like...
Do it.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. Like it literally could just be written like that, hey?
Do it acceptable to an acceptable standard.
However you
What
feel
that
is
standard
acceptable.
is up to you.
Yeah, exactly. Additionally, no information about this specific regulation was required to be present on any packaging of any of the wiring tapes. So weirdly, the coroner then went on to make the recommendation that steps should be taken to ensure that the number of the appropriate Australian standard and electrical safety regulation is present on packaging for electrical tapes, and only tapes certified for electrical work be used when performing electrical work or live wiring in Australia. Which I found weird because I'm like, but then when you import it from whatever country and or use any of the how many tapes that are available in the market, I was just like, that seems an excessive recommendation to me.
Also,
but anyway.
putting the number of a standard on there is not going to make people read it.
No.
Well, you can't freely access the Australian standards anyway.
Yeah.
Unless you're in that industry and your company or whatever has paid for them.
Exactly.
Yeah, I understand the part of the recommendation that says only use electrical tape that's approved for electrical work.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But the
that makes
standard
sense.
bit,
It's
seems
a bit weird.
So apparently, we're only allowed to use Australian manufactured electrical tape
Essentially, yeah.
in Australia.
I feel like, needless to say, that recommendation was not implemented.
Or could have been implemented in part.
Not that I've seen. I don't buy
Yeah.
electrical tape, to be honest, but I would
Neither do I.
assume. So additional to the poor insulation, the investigation following the incident found that at no point before commencing the work did the electrician attempt to remove the fuse connecting the electrical supply to the house that would have allowed him to not work with live electricity. And this was evidenced by the fact that they hadn't even on the day brought with them a fuse extraction stick or attempted to disconnect by climbing the nearest Energex pole so that there was no power source to the house.
Like, two things there. One, I feel like the fuse extraction stick
Yes.
would be part of your normal toolkit that you would take to every job.
Potentially,
Surely.
but not on this day.
And, like, climbing the nearest Energex pole, okay, well, you're going to need a cherry picker for that.
No, you needed a ladder. So, and they had
so it's
taken...
not that tall.
Yeah.
Okay.
So whatever they were like could have done needed a ladder, and they had taken a ladder and they had not removed said ladder from the van on the day.
Yeah, okay. So they had the ability to do the
To do
second
it, but
one
they didn't
for
do it.
sure.
Yes, but they didn't. Yeah. As I said, they shouldn't work live.
Isn't that like electrician school 101?
That's the first thing you learn.
Like turn off the
Okay, no. So
electricity source.
So legitimately, it seems like no. It seems like that was not particularly standard amongst electrical work in the 1990s. And so ultimately, there was actually some inquest and regulations introduced, including the Electrical Safety Act in 2002. And this happened in 2006.
Yeah.
Which was as a result of a number of deaths by electrocution in the late 90s. So apparently not that common prior to then.
And potentially they've been trained in the 90s.
Yeah.
And therefore that's not how they
that's
learn
right.
to do things.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So these new regulations said don't perform it live unless you absolutely have to. And then if you absolutely have to, you need to make sure that you've done like lots of checks and safety assessments to make sure you do, such as telling people that you're working with live electricity.
Yeah.
And then each exposed part is treated as if it's energized until it's isolated and proved not to be as well. So also just even if you are not working live, you should still be just as cautious.
Yep.
And so with the introduction of that new legislation, the Electrical Safety Office, in conjunction with the Electrical and Communications Association and the Electrical Trades Union, had provided extensive seminar programs to educate electricians and trade workers across Brisbane and regional Queensland, because this was introduced in Queensland. They then had subsequently disseminated information through events, seminars and brochures after that first 12 months of trying to inform people about the new act over the subsequent 5 years between 2003 and 2008. So the coroner essentially also said that the electrician should have been aware of this new information by the efforts that had already been undertaken by those three organisations. And so the coroner basically said, well, I don't think much more could have been done with this regulation, nor is there really anything the coroner could recommend with regards to that legislation, because all that work had already been invested in trying to make sure electricians were aware not to work live. Yeah. So ultimately the coroner was like, there's no recommendation I can make here. You should know it exists.
Yeah, and abide
And you
by
should,
it.
follow it.
Yeah.
Was there any prosecutions then made out of this?
The coroner went on to say, I'm going to refer this electrician to the Electrical Licensing Committee and the Director of Public Prosecution. And the coroner's reasoning for this was, and I quote, because they reasonably suspected an offence, manslaughter, had been committed. So yes.
Yeah.
And then I couldn't find any information about the electrician and any sort of
It
prosecution.
might have settled. So next we'll be discussing the coroner's findings regarding the inquest into the death of Harry Joseph Evans.
Okay.
Harry passed away in October of 2018 while working as a deckhand on a prawn trawler in the Gulf of Carpentaria, which for those who are maybe not familiar with the Gulf of Carpentaria, it's the large sea in Northern Australia which sits between the peaks of the Northern Territory and Queensland.
Okay, cool.
Oh, okay.
So it's that big body of water.
Yep.
Thank you.
In between.
I needed that
Yeah.
clarification.
Yeah. It's
I was
right
like-
up north.
Okay.
So Harry was a 23-year-old English backpacker. He was a backpacker who'd come to Australia with the hopes of travelling the country and spending some time working on a fishing boat that was operated by a relative in Australia.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Yep.
I was going to say that seems quite niche.
Oddly
but
specific,
if you've got
yes.
a relative.
He's got a relative who said,
Yeah.
come hang out, you can work on my fishing boat.
Cool.
kind of thing. And he was a 23-year-old lad who was like, yeah,
Let's do it.
Why not? So Harry arrived in Australia in August 2018, and 4 days later he joined the crew of a prawn trawler operating out of Fisherman's Wharf in Darwin. So I don't think that's the fishing boat that his relative owned, but
Okay.
he had an objective in mind in terms of what he wanted to do, and he went and he did it.
Yeah.
So, yes. In the early hours of the 4th of October 2018, so about 2 months after Harry arrived in Australia, the prawn trawler that he was working for was fishing in the waters north of the Vandalia Islands in the Gulf of Carpentaria. Harry had commenced his shift working on the prawn trawler at approximately 3 a.m. that morning. At around 8:20, the fishing nets were being lowered into the tray of the vessel. I'm assuming they'd had the nets in the water overnight to get the prawns, and then we're pulling the prawn. It wasn't specific, but this is just my assumption. But they were pulling the prawns up. I also don't eat prawns, so I can't think of anything worse.
Yeah, true.
This is how they get prawns, guys.
Yeah.
For those who indulge or like prawns. So the skipper of the trawler was operating the winch as the nets were coming in, and Harry was ensuring that the nets were folding correctly into the tray. Notably, Harry was wearing sunglasses, a long-sleeve shirt, board shorts, and gumboots, but he was not wearing any gloves.
That's a very attractive outfit.
It really is, isn't it?
So as the net was coming in, Harry was observed by the skipper to shake his hand as if in pain. He said he'd been bitten on the finger by a snake.
That's not generally where I find snakes, but go on.
Well, look, there are sea snakes. I'm not sure if Australia has many of them.
Do they bite you like an on-land snake?
I assume so.
Oh, we're about to find out.
Oh, okay. Please,
So
go on.
the skipper went to the net and observed what he believed to be either a black-banded sea snake or an elegant sea snake that was about 50 centimetres long. He picked it up with a tail, freed it from the net, and threw it over the side of the vessel.
You don't want it biting anyone else.
You really
so that
don't.
makes sense.
So the skipper told Harry to take a shower and then go to the bridge of the trawler. The skipper then made a call to another vessel and then to the Royal Flying Doctors Service, which was recorded as being made at 8:23 a.m.
This is not going at all where I thought this was going.
No, definitely not.
Oh my god. Emma, how do you find these cases?
So when back on the bridge, Harry's hand was soaked in a bowl of Dettol, iodine, and water. His arm was wrapped from the armpit to the wrist in a compression bandage. Because remember, he was bitten on the finger. So Harry said he'd felt fine. The first mate began researching snake bites, and the skipper then called care flight at 8:43 a.m. So at this point, the trawler was 56 nautical miles from the nearest port in Groote Island in the Northern Territory. I don't really know how far that was. I could have Googled it, but I didn't. But it's a distance.
That seems like a reasonable distance.
Yeah.
You're not going to get there in 5 minutes.
No. So a plan was made for the skipper to steam towards the nearest town in Groote Island, where there was a health clinic in that town. It was estimated that this would take 6 to 7 hours.
Yeah, right.
So not close by at all.
That's about 100 kilometres. Okay.
So at some point, the skipper noticed that Harry's eyelids were drooping. At this point, the skipper made another call to care flight to seek some medical advice.
I suppose, like, most people, when they are bitten by a snake, aren't envenomated. But still, you got to assume that they are.
Mm.
And so I'm surprised that there wasn't like it's going to take us 7 hours to get somewhere. Can we get some more help, please?
It sounds like they were doing all the right things as well.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
they were following first aid protocols and calling
Yeah.
the people they needed to call. It's not like they were like, yeah, it'll be all right. Don't worry about it.
True.
So at that point, Harry said to the first mate of the trawler, "I can't control my eyelid. It keeps drooping down." And he asked if his lips were really fat. Harry said that his lips felt numb, but he felt fine and he wasn't in any pain. So soon after, it was noted that the trawler was actually closer to the port of Bong. However, Bong was then another 75 kilometres by road to the nearest health clinic. So the closest point of land...
He's not close to a health clinic.
Yeah, exactly. But the other direction that they were going in had a health clinic in the city, so that's why they originally were told to go that way.
Yeah.
But because his condition started deteriorating, they were like, let's just try and get him to land.
Yeah, I suppose someone
As
could be
quickly-
coming to meet you at the same time.
Yeah.
Exactly,
Yeah,
as quickly as possible, rather than worrying about getting to the closest health clinic.
Yep.
So the skipper was then directed to turn around and steam to Bong. By the time the boat had turned around, Harry was experiencing more symptoms of snake envenomation. His vision had become blurred, and he said that his cheeks were numb and he was feeling dizzy. It was estimated that at this point the vessel was still 4 hours from Bing Bong.
Oh, that's too long.
Yeah.
So emergency service efforts were then directed to getting to the vessel rather than him.
The moment they thought that he was envenomated, there should have been like, we want a helicopter to us right now.
Yeah.
And even then, I'm not sure that they would have necessarily been able to get a helicopter to him fast enough.
Yeah.
So this was all happening around 10:30 in the morning, so about 2 hours after he was bitten, with the Royal Australian Air Force, or RAAF, agreeing to send a helicopter. However, the helicopter would not arrive until 3:15 p.m.
Oh, no.
due to the remoteness of the area, like getting
they're
a
in.
helicopter into the area.
Right.
And as I said, at this point, it was around 10:30 a.m., so they're only 4 hours from land. So getting a helicopter
5 hours to them isn't actually that helpful.
that's not helpful.
wasn't beneficial at all.
And was that helicopter staffed with any help, or was that just helicopter to fly him to more help?
I think it was helicopter staff with the least equipment. And people who could use that equipment.
They could help. Okay.
Yeah. So at this time, Harry was in rapid deterioration. His heart rate had dropped and he was convulsing.
Oh, that escalated. Okay.
So a conference call was arranged between CareFlight, the RAAF, and other medical providers, which remained in place for the next 5 hours.
That is a lot longer than I thought
Mm.
he would have needed them for.
So at 10:40 a.m., Harry became unresponsive, and CPR was commenced and continued for the next 4 hours.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's a really, really, really long time to be doing CPR.
Yeah.
And, like, obviously there's not just one person doing it, but...
So other fishing vessels in the area were called and they responded.
how lovely that they all
Yeah.
helped.
So
Okay.
other vessels ended up bringing medical supplies like EpiPens and defibrillators to the
Them.
vessel
Yeah, right.
to assist. So also at 11:30 a.m, a jet set off from Cairns to drop more medical supplies off to the vessel, but the flying time was about 2 hours.
Yeah.
And at 12:50 p.m, a fast catamaran set out from Bing Bong with a doctor and a nurse on board with sufficient equipment to intubate Harry, and they took just under 2 hours to get there as well.
Yeah, wow.
So it's just
that
the
is
absolute
a phenomenal
remoteness.
effort, though. Like, that is incredible, the amount of people they were able to resource to get there, even though they couldn't. Yes, you ideally would just like a helicopter to show up and take him away. Like, the amount of other trawlers, other flights, other stuff that they could get to him that's incredible, though.
It's still, it's an impressive rally of people trying to get around him. So medical staff from that catamaran boarded the vessel at about 2:30 p.m, but by that time, Harry had been provided with 5 doses of adrenaline. The doctor intubated him and gave him 3 more doses of adrenaline. However, he couldn't be revived and was declared deceased at 2:48 p.m.
Wow.
So you think about, he was bitten at just before 8:30
Yeah,
in the
wow.
morning.
That's pretty
and
quick.
This is now
Yeah.
2:30 in the afternoon. He has passed away. So an autopsy was conducted on Harry and a puncture mark was found on his right hand on his pinky finger. So samples were sent for venom detection, but at the time this report was handed down in January 2020, the results had not yet been provided.
Even then, I would have thought it might have been pretty unlikely because, like, there'd just be all this risk of it essentially being washed away, or
And, like, he'd put his hand in a bowl of
Dettol and
iodine and water. So
yeah,
Yeah, that's right.
And it doesn't really change
it's not going to change
the
anything.
outcome or anything.
No, and I think there was no sort of debate over his cause of death.
Yeah,
Apparently, all sea snakes of any description are known to have very potent venom, which I didn't know.
okay, right.
Apparently, yes, sea snakes are very venomous, but of course, most of the time you're not bitten by them if you kind of come into contact with them. And they said apparently it's really, really common for people on fishing boats and trawlers to come into contact with sea snakes. Like,
Oh, really?
not uncommon for them to see, 20 a day
Oh, wow.
or something like that. Trapped
They
in
just
the
get
nets.
caught up in those nets.
Yeah, that's
Wow.
right.
But
But
then
they
they don't get bitten.
They just don't generally get bitten. And if they do get bitten, it's a dry bite.
Right, so it just isn't envenomated.
Yeah,
okay.
that's right. So evidence was given that the best treatment for snake bites is compression and immobilization until antivenom can be secured. And this treatment is said to delay the effects of the venom by about 30 minutes, which of course is very valuable. Like 30 minutes is great, but not when
you're 5 hours away from somewhere.
Exactly. So
if you're in the city 10 minutes from a hospital,
great.
Sure.
That's
Compression,
would be very helpful.
Don't move. Get to the hospital. 30 minutes, fantastic. But in this case, it wasn't helpful, unfortunately. So expert evidence was given at the inquest, which explained that Harry needed airway management to save his life because the neurotoxic venom had incapacitated the muscles required to breathe. So basically, compression wasn't going to work. Anti-venom might not have worked. It was like he needed to be intubated.
Just ventilate him until...
He needed his airway to be protected.
Yeah.
Was the bottom line.
Okay.
So the conclusion made by the coroner was that the chances of survival after a sea snake bite in a remote location are very poor, and that the provision of airway intubation kits and bags on vessels is not an answer, as these tools require a great deal of training. So basically one of the things he sort of considered was, okay, if he needed airway protection, why should we not have intubation kits on trawlers? And the reason is because people won't know how to use them. Yeah. So what's the point of having them?
Yeah.
Do some reasonable damage if you don't know what you're doing.
Well, that's exactly right. And it's not like one of those things where you can easily be trained, like in CPR or something like that.
Or an EpiPen.
Like a lay person.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. You need proper medical training to be able to intubate someone. The coroner also noted that a sizable percentage of victims who are treated by antivenom have anaphylactic reactions. So carrying antivenom on vessels is also not a realistic solution because you will be causing more harm by administering it and not knowing that, someone's allergic to it. Then
you need to then be trained
exactly. So you just
anaphylactic management as well.
Correct. So it just would create more issues potentially than it would help. And obviously antivenom is very specific to certain species of snakes, etc., etc. So again, carrying that on board, and I'm sure it's probably quite expensive.
Yeah. It's expensive. It'll have a short shelf life. So then you'd be having to buy more of it, or you'd have an expired version. Same with the EpiPens. I'm like, okay, yeah, sure. If you store the antivenom, then you've got to store at least 2 EpiPens with it. Same thing. The EpiPens will go out of date. And then you either be administering out-of-date product or you'll be wasting a lot of product. And so people aren't going to want that as a solution when there needs to be alternate considerations, such as how do you get people there quicker or whatever else.
Yeah, that's right. So obviously because this was a death that occurred in a workplace, WorkSafe in the Northern Territory was involved. So the coroner turned to the draft WorkSafe report in relation to the incident, and in short, the investigation by WorkSafe found that the vessel log did not meet the requirement of the safety management system, as there was no induction records or record of training and skills kept on the boat.
Is that all relevant to him getting bitten by a sea snake, though?
It depends, I guess, if their policy was that you should be wearing a certain type of glove.
Oh, yeah,
while
I
you're
forgot about
working,
that. Yeah,
which that may have prevented him from getting
There was not,
bitten.
because there was no specified personal protective equipment or PPE or policy on handling marine animals.
Yeah, right.
So that didn't exist. And there was no log of any such thing existing.
So the log should exist and people should therefore also be trained once the log has been developed.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
So the report did not indicate whether the employer had been asked to revise its documents and procedures, and there was no indication as to whether WorkSafe intended to ensure that the employer would revise its procedures. So WorkSafe basically just handed down this draft report to the coroner and was like, they don't have any of this stuff. That's what we found.
Yep. Should they? I don't know.
The coroner would have loved that.
Exactly. So the report concluded that a safety alert was sufficient to remedy the identified issues.
Was it? Was it, though?
Doesn't seem like it, does it? Just, guys, remember to update your safety procedures and make sure
you feel like it.
Yeah, if you feel like it. So yeah, they said that it was sufficient to remedy the identified issues and that the identified breaches had no causal link to Harry's death. I.e., if there had been an adequate safety management system in place, Harry still would have died. Which
I don't know that I agree. That depends on having gloves that would have prevented him from getting bitten.
Yeah, would the bite have envenomated through a glove?
An
what kind of glove
anti-bite.
would you be able to wear?
And
And
would
could
they
you
be able
still
to wear
work?
those gloves while still working? Like, are they going to inhibit their ability to do their job?
And would training someone to do that, such as wear your personal protective gear, have prevented this in the first place? So there's lots of steps, which I get, but I'm not entirely convinced that you can say no, not causative at all.
Well, the coroner didn't accept WorkSafe's conclusion, noting that this was the draft report. So
I feel like someone's making some updates after this.
no. So WorkSafe handed down the final report and it was unchanged from the draft.
Excellent.
So there was still no indication of whether procedures would be revised by the employer. So on this basis, the coroner determined that he should hold an inquest.
Oh.
Wait, hang on. Okay, so there was no planned coronial inquest for this
No.
death until that draft report was finalised and the
Yeah.
coroner went, yeah, no.
Basically, he was like,
Who is this coroner?
I think it's Kavanagh. He's the NT coroner. He's the one who does all the NT.
Well, presumably only for a period of time. Like, he hasn't been alive forever.
No, he's been back since the 80s, I think.
Oh, wow.
He's like a long-serving.
Oh, I am impressed.
There are a few other conclusions that I haven't gone into too much detail, but basically they said there was no reason to refer to the Department of Prosecutions at this point for a potential prosecution. They eventually did refer the file, although I don't know if it went anywhere, just in relation to the skipper of the vessel and whether he had any culpability in the death.
Because he didn't train his employee appropriately,
And there was
is that
no
essentially?
training manuals and things
Yeah.
like that there.
Okay.
An infringement notice was handed down by the Maritime Safety Board
Okay.
just in relation to
Yeah, right.
the failings, but that's obviously independent of this
The coroner,
inquest.
yeah.
But it was reported in the inquest, so it must have happened before the inquest happened. And there was
Yeah.
obviously a delay getting all this information to the coroner because WorkSafe was doing their report.
Yeah.
They got the draft report, and then the coroner was like, hey, what's going on here? The tone of the report and how the coroner's reporting on it
Yeah.
was that they were a bit laissez-faire,
Yeah.
I guess, in terms of their response. And then obviously didn't change anything between the draft report and the final report.
And I can see the, like, workers don't normally get bitten.
No.
It would be unlikely that you happen to be 7 hours away from shore.
Yeah.
And a number of steps had to happen for this outcome. And so maybe this is very rare and unlikely and all that kind of stuff. But I still think the concept of making sure that if you're working on a trawler, that there are some workplace safety measures
Correct.
is still
And-
necessary.
And there was actually another very interesting case, which I would like to do eventually, but it is another prawn trawler case that happened not too long before this case that this
Yeah.
coroner also reported on, where it was someone who passed away on a prawn trawler again, and the issue was just the remoteness. It was a
Yeah.
different cause of death.
Yeah.
But the remoteness in this
Had an
circumstance
impact.
had a massive factor like it did here
Yeah.
as well. So although, yes, sea snake bites, not common. In fact, this is the first known death in Australia from a sea snake bite, at least in the workplace sense.
Yeah.
So that's uncommon. But, you know, having medical issues in remote areas is not that uncommon.
No,
Yeah.
and that can happen on land as well as on sea in
exactly.
Australia because we're such a vast country. So,
yeah, exactly. So that was more, I think, where issue was taken.
Yeah.
So following Harry's death, Harry's employer appeared to be proactive, ensuring the risk of sea snake bites be minimised. They updated their safety management systems proactively to reflect the hazards and how to respond in an emergency, which for sea snakes reads, hazard, sea snakes in Australian waters are very venomous. These snakes can sometimes be very aggressive after being trawled.
Oh, okay.
Fair enough. The handling procedure. If you do encounter a sea snake, follow the following procedure. Approach from the rear of the snake. Always use and wear PPE, including puncture-resistant gloves. Always use sea snake hooks and grubbers for handling and removing sea snakes. Do not handle sea snakes by hand.
Seems fair.
Yeah, that seems very reasonable.
So there you go. So that's what the employer did. Proactively, not as a response to the website report.
Yeah. Sorry, I was like, going back to the original story though, you didn't really mention whether he proactively went and grabbed the snake or whether he just happened to have put his hand where a snake was.
No, it sounds like he just put his hand where a snake was.
Yeah,
Mm.
okay.
Yeah.
No, I like that they're saying don't approach, but it also seems like,
That, again, was not the circumstance of this.
Yeah.
All it said was that he
He
shook
got
his
bitten.
hand and
Yeah.
he was like, ow. So I don't know if he saw the snake beforehand. I would assume not.
Yeah.
true.
But it doesn't go into that. The employer also now provides pre-departure safety awareness sessions, which include training in the safety management system, including sea snake awareness. Their first aid kits were updated to include proper compression bandages and EpiPens, And the company at the time of the inquest was looking to introduce defibrillators to their vessels in the next season as well. So they'd proactively updated.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I like that.
Good
So
on them.
on the basis of that, the coroner didn't hand down any formal findings in relation to sea snake safety or that sort of thing. He did, however, provide some recommendations to the regulator.
No surprises there.
No.
Shocker.
So he recommended that where WorkSafe identifies deficiencies in safety system, that action be taken to ensure that deficiencies are rectified.
Do something about it if you find it.
So basically, he was like, look, the employer has done what they're supposed to. No thanks to WorkSafe.
Yeah.
WorkSafe has just said, this is where they went wrong.
The end.
The end, basically. And the coroner just said, that's not good enough.
Good on the coroner.
Yeah.
Yes, no recommendations were made in relation to the actual facts of Harry's death. It was just to the regulator for, I guess, somewhat lackadaisically reporting on the death.
I can see a little bit of their side of it, but I'm still very much with the coroner on this one.
Especially after the coroner said, I don't...
This draft seems a little, light on.
Yeah,
do you think maybe you want to update? No.
Maybe let's do some next steps or something.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Yeah. Interesting though.
Okay, so I'll be telling you about the inquest into the death of Alan Wigg, who passed away on the 3rd of December 2004. He worked at a banana farm in Wangan. I hope that's how you say it.
This will be like Tumblegum. Tumblegum.
In northern Queensland, about an hour south of Cairns.
Okay.
A big part of working on a banana farm is bagging the bananas. So this involves pruning, encasing the bananas in a bag, and then treating them with insecticides. Banana bagging machines were introduced to make this process quicker. So this machine is a type of elevating work platform, and the operating height generally isn't higher than 3.6 metres.
And it's bagging bunches of bananas?
It's not. The human is doing the bagging. It's essentially like a cherry picker. So they use it to travel between the banana trees and to get high enough to work on the bananas.
Oh, okay.
So it's like a cherry picker that you drive along and then you go up.
Yeah.
Bag the bananas, go back down, drive a little bit more.
Okay, so it's just the machinery to assist you with what you're
bagging
otherwise
the
doing.
banana.
Okay.
Yeah. But it needs to be able to drive on like farm tracks, essentially. So it's not just a standard cherry picker that you would use to... So the owners of the banana farm bought a banana bagging machine on the 7th of July, 1999.
And this happened in 2004?
Yes.
Okay.
The man who manufactured the machine was a qualified plant mechanic, which is a combination of diesel mechanic, boilermaker, and fitter and turner. It was considered that a properly maintained banana bagging machine would last 10 years, although the number of hours it was used and poor maintenance could affect that lifespan of the machine.
I'm getting some foreshadowing here.
Yes, definitely. So the specific banana bagging machine on this property had 4 wheels and a boom that could be raised and lowered.
Yeah, okay.
The operator stands in a basket on a platform at the end of the boom. Okay. The basket comes up to the operator's waist and doesn't leave them much room to move around, so pretty much just standing there. They're not walking around on that platform in the basket.
Yeah, and I would assume that that's a good thing, though, like, because you essentially don't want to be falling out of it.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, okay.
The operator controls the machine from the basket using controls on the platform. So everything you need is in that basket. To move the machine forward, the operator pressed the right-hand side of a foot pedal, which is connected by a transmission cable to the hydraulic transmission pump.
So it's essentially an accelerator.
Yes.
Okay.
The left side of the foot panel was used to reverse the machine. There were also steering controls on the platform because obviously you needed to be able to steer it. There was a park brake on the front left-hand side with a brake operation switch on the platform controls.
Mm-hmm.
When it was pushed forward, it de-energized the brake solenoid, causing the brake caliper to be applied. There was also an emergency stop button that also activated the park brake.
Okay.
There were also 4 hydraulic drive motors attached to the wheels. When the foot was removed from what we call the acceleration pedal, a hydraulic pressure caused the swash plate control lever to centralize, which pushed the foot pedal into the neutral position. When there was no oil flow from the hydraulic pump, it caused hydrostatic lock in each motor. The manufacturer stated that using this brake would stop the machine within 2 meters when driving at top speed. So essentially, you take your feet off any pedals and it will come to a stop.
Right.
Without you needing to apply a brake.
Gotcha.
But there is also a park brake if you need it.
And an emergency brake should things be going really wrong, but ultimately the machine's not just going to like go on its own.
Yeah, it shouldn't
if you're
keep
like
traveling if you were not inside it. Yeah. The platform was supported by front and rear platform leveling rods, which were secured by pins. So the machine had a number of modifications that weren't performed or authorised by the manufacturer.
So they, I presume, happened by the owner of the banana plant?
Not the owner. They had someone else that they had do engineering work on the farm.
But it was as a contract of the owner of the machine versus the manufacturer of the machine.
Correct.
Yep.
So these modifications included removal of the parking brake, a new materials basket welded to the operator's basket, hydraulic hoses placed externally on the machine instead of internally within the boom, a new boom support post welded to the turntable, and additional gussets and plates welded to the boom, and new pins and welds holding the pins.
And were these done to improve the functionality, or were they done like fixes like the Royal Show situation where they're like, something's broken, so I'm going to band-aid it together?
Yeah, I feel like it was more of a fixing it as things needed to be replaced.
Yep.
So Alan started working at the farm on the 24th of May 2004, and on the 9th of June 2004 he filled out a safety induction for new workers. This included workplace policies and basic general rules for all workers on the farm. One of the farm owners showed Alan how to operate the banana bagging machine, including how it worked, how to start and stop it, as well as routine maintenance. He watched Alan using the machine and putting up some bags and decided that he was competent to use that machine. If there were any issues with the machine, Alan would let the owner know, who would arrange to have it serviced. Okay. So that's where all of these modifications came from. So around 2 or 3 p.m. on the 1st of December 2004, Alan approached the owner to let him know that a hydraulic hose on the machine was leaking. An experienced fitter and turner who did a lot of light engineering work for the farm was there at the time, and he helped the owner and Alan take a look at the machine. They tried to find the hose which was leaking, but the hoses that went through the boom were held in place with a plate. So the pins that were welded to hold that plate in had to be removed so they could get access to it. It was identified that repairs to the hydraulics would be needed, so the owner called a local hydraulic service company and they sent out an employee who arrived at about 4:30 p.m. This employee was the one to suggest that the hydraulic hoses be positioned on the outside of the boom because they were being chafed by the internal fixation.
As a result of its manufacturing, or as a result of another amendment that they'd already made to the machine?
I think it was just as a result of the manufacturing.
Okay.
Yeah. The employee came back the next day with steel pipes to house the hoses and welded brackets onto the boom to hold those steel pipes. They also needed to put the pins in, but neither the employee or the owner had seen how they had come out the previous day. They put the pins in a way that seemed correct and welded them in where there were previous weld marks.
Seemed correct.
Seemed correct.
Okay.
Yep. The next morning of the 3rd of December, the owner went to Cairns in the early morning. Alan put the front panel back onto the banana bagging machine, inspected the machine as he usually did before he used it, and then started work. At about 10:50 a.m., a witness heard a loud revving coming from the farm, and as she passed the machine, she saw a body under the boom of the machine, which was Alan.
That's not where I want anyone to be.
No.
So I ran him over?
Yes. So police and ambulance arrived at the scene at the same time. They found Alan deceased, lying under the machine towards the front of the machine, which was still running. The machine had collided with a palm tree, which had stopped its forward movement.
But you said it should slow down on its own.
Within 2 meters.
So, like, even if you've collided into something, does that mean the machine should essentially stop revving?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Also, I did want to circle back to, like, you said they removed the park brake, but we'll come to that,
We will come to that,
yeah.
yes. So an investigation found that as Alan was driving the machine along the track, the rear levelling support pin fell out because of a failure of the welds, causing the work platform to collapse and ejecting Alan from the basket.
Oh.
The machine continued to move forward, which crushed Alan's head.
Jeez, alright.
Wow. Okay.
Yep.
And so is that because there was a fault in the acceleration of it at that point as well? Like,
Yeah, so there were multiple
issues
issues
Okay.
with it.
Okay.
So the pin did not have a snug fit when it was inserted after the hoses were repaired, and the weld was inadequate to deal with the forces that were upon it. The weld was weak because it had tried to weld high tensile steel, being the pin, which was a replacement pin from the one that was originally on the machine, to mild steel, which is what the rest of it was made out of.
Okay.
These two types of steel have different properties, and while a weld between these two is possible, it would be a more complex undertaking than just a simple weld.
But the person who was repairing, in theory, was someone who was qualified in their trade to do so?
The person who welded it, so he was the hydraulic
Person.
guy, and he did mention a couple of times to the owner, like, do you want to wait for the guy who did a lot of your engineering work and was good with welding? Do you want to wait for him to come and do this? And he's like, no, I don't want to wait. Yeah, if you're happy to do it, just do it. And he was like, yeah, okay. But he
That
also
sucks.
didn't know, I don't think he knew that the pins were high tensile because he wasn't the one who had replaced them.
Yeah, he was just told, just put these back. They were there.
And yeah, they were there, welded in.
off you
He was
go.
like, yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Cool.
okay.
So because the hydraulic hoses were on the outside of the boom, the collapse of the working platform interfered with the hoses. So the machine's braking system should have worked to return the gears to neutral and therefore stop the machine if the operator was ejected from the basket.
Right, but the hydraulics weren't responding the appropriate way because
Because they were interfered with, because when it fell, instead
Yeah.
of being inside the boom where they would have been protected,
Yeah.
they were on the outside and they got essentially, I think, like kinked or
Yeah.
damaged in some way when the platform fell onto it.
Yeah.
That they then didn't work as they should have.
Yeah,
which is
right.
why it continued to move forward
Oh.
and crushed him.
Okay.
So there's multiple things going wrong.
So it
that
wasn't like the
happened.
accelerator got jammed on. It was
No.
like they couldn't function the way that they should have. Yeah.
Yep. And at the time of this incident, the parking brake of the machine was getting fixed and so was not on the machine. And not that he would have necessarily been able to, they sort of went into this, he wouldn't have necessarily had time to activate that parking brake.
Yeah.
But it's just another deficiency that it
Yeah.
wasn't attached to the machine at the time.
Yeah, like you shouldn't be utilizing the machine if it doesn't have such a mandatory function
Yeah.
as a parking brake.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
So the machine had a hole where a safety harness could be secured, but a harness was never provided by the owners, and it sort of seems that the harnesses weren't really used in the banana industry
Okay.
because there were no harnesses designed for the particular needs of the industry and the work that they were doing, and also because operators wanted to be able to get out of the basket quickly if a venomous snake was found in the banana tree.
Never in my life have I been like, just in case a venomous snake comes at me, I want to be able to eject quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
From 3 meters in the air, I want to be able to jump off that because of the snake.
I mean, that seems
No,
really
I feel
fair.
that.
I get it.
You don't want to be trapped there.
How often does it happen? Clearly often enough.
Oh,
That,
yeah, I think often enough
Yeah.
that they come
Wow.
across them relatively
All right, then.
often. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm trying to then think of how a safety harness could be implemented if you then also have a need to eject quickly.
Yeah, which is kind of the two opposite.
Yeah, I'm like, what kind of design could you go for? But it doesn't
Mm.
seem like there's a great option there.
No. So some of the coroner's recommendations were that the Office of Workplace Health and Safety Queensland facilitate the development and use of a harness for banana bagging machines. So they actually try and figure out how they can make one that suits the industry.
Yeah, that's going to be tough.
An urgent need for inspection of current machinery or an alert issued to ensure all banana bagging machines are checked by a competent person and modifications be checked. And that the Office of Workplace Health and Safety consider developing a system for systemic and regular inspection of high-risk farm machinery to ensure compliance with Australian standards.
Yeah, I mean, I
Mhm.
would have thought that actually already existed.
I don't think it did at the time.
Yeah,
And
wow.
they did go into a little bit that the coroner was quite critical that the owners didn't have any logbook for any of the work that was done
Right.
on the machine. Like there was no record of
Maintenance
regular
manual,
service or
yeah.
maintenance or what was done.
Yeah,
To
I
the
would
machine.
have thought that that would have been mandatory, but
And I don't
Yeah.
know, even if it is mandatory, how do you police that. Unless
true.
you've got people coming to the farm to be like, where's the logbook for this machine?
So inserting those pins, that person wasn't really aware if it had been documented somewhere.
Yeah,
would that have made it helpful?
Yes.
But it may not have, because that person wasn't within their standard work. So would it being written down actually have made any difference?
Because what should have happened is they should have waited
Yes,
for
ideally,
that person who did all of the engineering work on the farm
Yeah.
for them to come back and be there when they put it all back together to make sure it went back the way it should.
Should have, yeah.
Because if the pin, like the hoses being on the outside is an issue, but wouldn't have been necessarily been an issue if the platform hadn't fallen off.
Yeah.
So like the failure of the pin was the main problem,
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Just one of those ones, again, where it's a number of things went wrong to cause that accident.
This is not the first time where we've had a case where it's like modifications being made to something because the expertise aren't available or the instruction given at the time isn't enough or something changes and you need to change the function of that, but then the change that's made is not necessarily safe or adequate.
Yeah.
It's definitely something I've never really contemplated much before around how you go about that, because I also just don't have an engineering brain to understand how one would even think that through or regulate it. So yeah,
exactly. And it's machinery used on private land.
But it would still be governed by workplace regulations.
Would be, yeah.
So same with like the quad bikes as well, right? In terms of if you're using them in a work environment, even though they might actually be somewhat sold for
private use
and entertainment, if you're using them to get around on a farm and you're therefore an employee of said farm, it still counts.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I imagine that regulation is so tough though, because how do you police that? How do you control it? How do you make sure it's being looked into is tough.
Yeah, I just thought that one's really interesting because I'd never heard of a banana bagging machine before.
No, nor had I.
I'm also interested by the fact that the paramedics showed up and the machine was still on and no, we just need to leave it as is for this investigation.
No, it was actually turned off. Someone who arrived on scene fairly early had turned off the machine.
Yeah.
It's just that I think when they first arrived, they noticed it was still running. But then someone who knew how to turn it off, because I think one of the police officers was like, I would have had no idea how to turn it off. But they don't know who turned it off and they don't know what position the controls were in at the time, which sort of hampered the investigation because they couldn't tell
what had happened.
Really had happened in terms of the controls and that sort of thing. So they sort of had to go with what they knew.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would have been a more thorough investigation if they had that information. But,
right.
You know, when you're on that sort of scene, you're trying to make it safe for everyone else. So turning off the machine that's running is a good idea.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm.
And then, your case, there was kind of not a lot of background about him or any other information.
He was a very conscientious worker. That's what they said.
That's more than I got.
He was one of the only workers who would go back to check on the banana trees he had bagged to make sure the work that he was doing was sufficient.
Oh, wow.
Oh, okay.
Because it was 15 weeks later or something that they then come back. He would come back and check.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
The ones that he had done.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's some good effort. Yeah, right.
Yeah, by all accounts, he was just doing his job as normal and quite well.
Right. All right, well, that was workplaces. I mean, there are so many workplace ones.
Oh, yeah.
This will not be the end of them, but that was some good shorter ones that it's been on our list of.
And some different ones as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.